I'd like to start off the top of this hour with an introduction to PEI and showing you our trailer that details what we do, who we are, why we exist. Thanks for attending the 24-hour Equinox Share-a-thon. And this is hour 12 of the 24, so we're almost halfway there. Takes a moment to load the video. You'll love the scenery, and I love listening to Sophie's voice. Here we go.
Polar Educators International is connecting educators, polar researchers, and communities for a better understanding of polar knowledge. Earth's polar regions are remote, beautiful, and challenging places, and they have a profound influence on every one of us. We know these vast amounts of snow, forming ice sheets, sea ice, and glaciers, together with massive currents of cold water, contribute dramatically to the climate and ecosystems of our world, systems which in turn drive the health of our local environments and communities. Research shows dramatic change in the Antarctic, in our mountainous regions, and particularly in the Arctic, home to over 4 million people, which is changing faster than anywhere else on Earth. Scientists are confirming that human activity is playing a significant role in these systems, increasing the planet's surface temperature in ways that cannot be balanced out by natural processes. It is clear the urgency to engage the next generation in polar research and to rise to the challenges that a changing climate will bring has never been greater. United in our passion for sharing the importance and value of the polar regions, educators and researchers from around the world have formed PEI, an essential global network developing polar knowledge to engage a global audience facing climate change. We are collaborating to strengthen this community, building resources and relationships, and helping local audiences connect polar research to their everyday lives. Polar Educators International amplifies the voices of all those dedicated to understanding and protecting our extraordinary polar regions, and all Earth's inhabitants, for generations to come. Join us.
Okay. Now, wanted to make you aware of a couple of things. Number one, if you're not already a member of PEI, of Polar Educators International, please join us. It's a wonderful network of scientists and educators. We're hosting a conference in Iceland in April of 2022, and it's going to be a great chance to. Okay. Sorry, that was interrupted there. But Joanna, you're recording now? I think she is. Okay, so it's going to be a series of professional development and networking opportunities. And we've been doing a lot of activities to kind of prep for this Iceland conference. And so check out some of our online networking and learning opportunities and activities in preparation for heading to Iceland. Also make sure that you post your comments and questions either during the event or after the event on our PEI Slack channel for the Equinox Share-a-thon, and also put things in the chat box that we can check during the different sessions that are being run by Zoom. And I'd like to turn it over now to Joanna, who will introduce her panel for the discussion.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Betty. So we are doing this hour an environmental education panel. Joining us for that are Dr. Martin Jeffries, Colleen Fisk, and Kenny Peavey. Dr. Martin Jeffries is a polar scientist with a long history in both research and policy. Colleen Fisk is the Energy Education Director at the Renewable Energy Alaska Project. And Kenny Peavey is an experiential educator and author. And with that, we're going to start. Each of them will give a short overview, sort of their background and some of their experiences. And then we'll open it up to some questions and discussion. And we're going to have Martin and then Colleen and then Kenny. So let me share the screen for Martin's piece. And there we go. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Joanna, and hello, everybody. And thank you for the invitation to be on the panel. This slide was prepared 16 years ago for a teacher research education workshop in Narragansett, Rhode Island. And while it may be somewhat old now, it's still very relevant to the topic of this panel and this meeting. So I am not going to go through that bullet by bullet. I will leave it there for you to read at your leisure. And I'm fine if Joanne were to email it around to anyone who wants it. There's no secrets in here. And it'll all look very familiar to everyone, I'm sure. But I'm instead going to tell you a short story as the slide is there in the background for you to look at. So I am, as Joanne said, I'm a polar scientist. I have been for, goodness knows, 40 something years. And I've worked in the Arctic and the Antarctic. I left the UK. You can tell I have a funny accent, an unconventional American accent. I left the UK 40 years ago. And went to the University of Calgary in Western Canada, did a PhD, and then I went up to Alaska, to the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And that was 1985, I went up to Alaska. In 1994, in the spring of 94, I got a phone call from the National Science Foundation. And I was asked, would I be willing to take a teacher with me to Antarctica later that year? And after a conversation, asking a few questions and hearing the right things, I said yes. And that teacher is in the photograph in the lower left corner of the slide, kneeling, measuring something, probably snow, is Marge Porter, who at the time was a middle school teacher in Connecticut. She still lives in Connecticut, but she's nominally retired now, retired in inverted commas. But she went to Antarctica with us to spend 6 or 8 weeks aboard the research vessel Nathaniel B. Palmer to study sea ice in the Pacific sector, the deep South Pacific sector of the Southern Ocean. And so that summer, Marge spent a few days with us in Fairbanks to meet the team, or most of them, and to learn about what she was letting herself in for. And she got to see the tools we would be using. She got to go in the freezer to cut up ice, learn how to use the tools on the sea ice and in the freezer on the ship and so on. And then we all met up again in Miami International Airport as we converged to get on the same flight to Santiago, Chile. And then from there onwards to Punta Arena on the Magellan Strait. And it was from Punta Arena that we left on the Nathaniel B. Palmer to go a very long way round to Auckland, New Zealand. That was the end of the cruise. And as I say, Marge spent all that time with us, embedded with the research team, being one of the researchers, and learning about sea ice and many other things from other people on the ship, other research teams, and so on. And we got off the ship a few weeks later, me gladly, because I suffer terrible seasickness and I'm always glad to get back on land off a ship. And we said goodbye and see you and let's stay in touch. And those weren't empty words. We have stayed in touch ever since, and we still work together. And I'll say a few more words about that. So in 1998 through 1999, I spent a year in Monterey, California on sabbatical. the only sabbatical leave I ever had from the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and spent a very pleasant year by the ocean. And towards the end of that year, my partner and I, she was also on sabbatical in Monterey with me, we started thinking about what are we going to do when we go back to Fairbanks? It's going to be a bit of an adjustment after living in such a pleasant place as Monterey. Back to the cold and the dark. What shall we do with ourselves? And we decided, let's start a lake ice research program, and let's do it locally around Fairbanks. Let's stop all this long distance travel and instead do some science and research in our backyard, almost literally, within a 10-mile radius of Fairbanks. And that's what we did when we returned we began that in October when we'd returned to Fairbanks. But before we left Monterey, my phone rang in the office at the Naval Postgraduate School where I was on sabbatical, and it was Marge Porter to say, "Hi, how are you? Are you enjoying your sabbatical? And I'm about to take a sabbatical and go back to school to the University of Connecticut and do a master's degree in environmental education. And I've chosen a particular module that involves doing field work and taking that field experience back to the classroom. And I have to write up lesson plans, and I have to introduce these to my students and so on. What field work are you doing in the next year? And if you are, can I come, please?" And I was able to tell Marge, "Your timing is impeccable. We're going back to Fairbanks and we're going to spin up a lake ice research project. Could you come up this coming winter and work with us?" And the answer was yes. And on 3 occasions, Marge came up for a week at a time and worked with us on the lake ice research project. And on the 3rd and final trip towards the end, it may have been when we went out for dinner to celebrate at the end of her 3rd trip and the end of her visits, we were, of course, chatting. And I distinctly remember Marge looking at me and saying, "I really appreciate what you've done, allowing me to join you. I've learned a lot. This is going to be great for my students to learn through what I've been learning. But, don't you think it's crazy? I have come all the way from Connecticut, clear across the continent, 3,000 miles or more, to learn from you and to take what I've learned back to my classroom. Have you thought about getting Alaska teachers involved in what you're doing?" She said, "I have no doubt that they would learn so much from you and it would be great for their students." And of course, I'm too stupid to have thought of such a thing. It took a teacher to see that. But we took that on board, and with Marge's help and the help of some education faculty at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, we started a program that involved Fairbanks teachers. We worked with the Fairbanks School Board to identify a number of teachers who would go out in subsequent winters out to the lakes on a Saturday morning to make the measurements. And what we were doing was measuring at about 10 different ponds. They were large ponds, small lakes. They were along a highway, the Steese Highway. These were ponds created by digging out gravel for building the road originally, and then they flooded after being dug out. And they made great outdoor laboratories for studying lake ice processes. And what we were doing was measuring snow depth along 100-meter long transects. We were measuring the snow density along that transect. We were measuring the snow temperature at the top of the snow and the bottom of the snow, or the top of the ice. And we were measuring the ice thickness. And from the snow measurements alone, density, temperature, and depth, we were calculating the conductive heat flow through the snow cover, which represented the conductive heat flow actually through the ice cover and then through the snow cover on it. And the conductive heat flow is the largest determinant of the ice thickness. If you don't have conductive heat flow, you won't have freezing of the water on the bottom and the ice won't grow thicker. So then, after some success working with the Fairbanks teachers, and we now go to the top right photograph, and that shows on the right a teacher from Portland, Oregon, although she taught in Vancouver, Washington, at the Vancouver School for the Deaf. Shannon is profoundly deaf, but in 2001, summer of 2001, I was asked, would I host Shannon for her TEA experience? And I said yes, and she came up in January, up to Fairbanks in January of 2001 to do what Marge did, to meet the team and learn about what she was letting herself in for. And then she spent 6 or 8 weeks in Fairbanks in March and April, deeply immersed in the research project and working with those Fairbanks teachers that we were working with, giving them a local research experience, experiential learning, hands-on, that they were sharing with their students. And it was very interesting working with Shannon because I don't know that I ever met anyone before who was profoundly deaf. Shannon could lip read, no problem. And she had received a lot of speech training, so she was able to talk as well. But we worked with an interpreter. There was a lot of American Sign Language going on as well. So she had 2 different interpreters, spent time with us, and they learned a lot about lake ice as well. But all in all, it was a wonderful experience. And then we created Allison, the only project I've had that has an abbreviation or acronym. Allison was the Alaska Lake Ice and Snow Observatory Network. And that was a network of teachers and their students all around the state of Alaska, which is a very large state, the largest state in the Union. And if there's anyone from Texas on the call, but we, having done all this work on lake ice around Fairbanks, we wanted to place it in a broader context. How does all this, what we're learning in Fairbanks, compare with elsewhere in Alaska? And there was no way that we could travel far and wide and often enough to make the necessary measurements. And working with the GLOBE program, which had a major presence in Alaska, we were able to recruit GLOBE teachers in many schools around Alaska who became our science partners along with their students. And they would go out on a regular basis to make exactly the same kind of measurements on their sites that we were making at ours. And a key to the success of Allison was our engagement with the teachers and students. We didn't just send them equipment with a user manual and say, go forth and make measurements and be scientists. We visited all the sites in the fall when the ice was thick enough and safe enough to go out on, and set up the research sites and show the teachers and students how to make the measurements, how to do them well, how to enter the data into a spreadsheet and so on, and make the calculations. And then we would go back in the spring to meet them again and talk to them about, well, what did you learn, et cetera, et cetera. And we also, and another critical point of Allison was we would have a 1-week workshop in Fairbanks each summer where we brought all the teachers together to work and play together, if you will. And the teachers played a big role in organizing that. So they took on responsibility for that. And so the slide and those bullets, the first 4 bullets in the top left they relate primarily to the teachers and some best practices, good practices, however you want to call it. And the bullets in the lower right corner, the 5 bullets, are bullets for researchers. And they reflect my belief that these environmental education opportunities that involve researchers working with teachers and students, it should not be a one-way street with the researchers imparting their brilliance to the teachers and students, that we should be humble enough to realize we have a lot to learn from the teachers and students. And that is what makes a successful teacher, researcher, educator experience, I think, that we have so much to learn from each other. And my 10 minutes is probably close to up. So I will stop there and hand back to Joanna, and I'll be happy to answer questions later. Thank you.
Sounds good. Thank you very much, Martin. So we're going to go ahead and hear from Colleen next from the Alaska Renewable Energy Alaska Project. There we go. Got it mostly in the right order.
Nice work. Thank you, Joanna. Really excited to be here trying to overcome my imposter syndrome of being part of this awesome panel, but appreciate Joanna inviting me to be a part of it. And I have been at least somewhat involved with PEI because I attended the International Polar Year in Montreal in 2012, actually as a pre-service teacher, and was there for that day beforehand. And my mentor teacher who I was doing my internship with at Palmer High in Alaska was got me involved with Globe. I got signed up for Globe training, and she got me into this conference and helped me get all the funding to be able to go. And so it's really exciting for me to be here as part of this after having had that experience in Montreal and meeting some folks there with the PEI. And so I have a few slides. I'm going to try really hard to stay on 10 minutes here. You can already tell slides hopefully will help me stay a little bit more on track. But I'm going to start out with the land acknowledgement. I grew up in Alaska on Dina-Ina lands, the Upper Cook Inlet, Athabascan, and that's also where I currently live outside of Wasilla. I spent some time in Anchorage as well, which are also on Dena'ina lands and on Otnanen. And so it's really important in our organization, we really think about this stewardship that these Indigenous peoples have had for thousands of years, and that we really try to take guidance from them and their knowledge and experience of the land and the resources as we think about how we are using it and transitioning. I think Joanna's probably the only one who knows my organization, which is Renewable Energy Alaska Project. And we're a nonprofit organization. There's 8 of us that work at REAP. And our focus is primarily on education. I do K through 12 education around the state. I think I've been at REAP 5 years now, and I think probably like my first week or two is when I met Joanna visiting our classroom doing a presentation for one of our initiatives. So great to be here as part of this. And we are all about increasing renewable energy in the state, but we actually talk about it as clean energy. So we focus a lot on energy efficiency as well, not just renewable energy. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our work as clean energy. You know, this is of course just one small part of environmental education, is this clean energy education. And I really see this as important because it's focusing on these solutions for our climate change and thinking about this adaptation to be more sustainable and resilient to the changes that are happening in our climate, but also as a way to hopefully reduce those impacts on our climate that, of course, Arctic and polar regions just get such disproportionate effect from that. And we also want to make sure that we're incorporating Indigenous knowledge, that we're really encouraging teachers to work within the community, working with elders who have this Indigenous knowledge, leaders within the community. So that is something that is not just teachers working completely on their own out of some textbook that was written in Texas, so to speak, which is less than half the size of Alaska. Not that Alaskans talk about that at all or anything. And that we're really thinking about these. And of course, place-based, and that's what environmental education is all about, is about that place-based education. And that's especially true for clean energy, is that we're thinking about this on what are those local resources close to you. And so things like field trips to power generation, whether it's a wind farm or even a diesel power plant, just understanding where that electricity is coming from. But that it doesn't also have to be this huge field trip or this huge project, that you can just do this within your own classroom and think about the school as a laboratory, as a place that uses a lot of energy. And so using that also as an example and thinking about that just even within your own room. And there is usually a facility manager that folks can work with. So these are some of the methods that we use when we're thinking about our clean energy education, when we're either writing curriculum or if we're working on visiting a classroom, even if it's just down the road in Anchorage, like at Joanna's, or if we're traveling all the way to Kotzebue or something, you know, that we want to keep all of these things in mind for our outreach. And so if you're not familiar with the energy literacy principles that the US Department of Energy has, of course, this is US specific, they are, if you're probably many of you are familiar with the climate literacy principles that the US has. And so these are similar to those. And we consider these as well, that as we develop a energy literate, that's what we want. We want energy literate folks within Alaska and within the US and within the whole world, hopefully, that we're able to think that those who are energy literate understand these things and that it helps them become someone who can make energy decisions. And so there's some amazing resources that are mostly US specific, but can be used internationally as well, the cleannet.org. So if you're not familiar with the Climate Literacy and Energy Awareness Network, that's another great place to find resources. I'm sure many of you are familiar, but don't want to assume anything. So here are the main resources that I use for teaching clean energy in Alaska. And so the first one is AK Energy Smart, which, like I said, we do a lot on energy efficiency and conservation, not just on renewable energy. Want to reduce our energy use first before we start adding on renewables and using more resources. And biggest part of that is Power Pledge Challenge, which I want to have a whole lot of time to talk about today, but is one of those things that is a project that we use, AK Energy Smart. And that's where most of my funding comes from. And we have a free curriculum that is associated with this program that I help edit and update. And then there's also Wind for Schools, which is a national program, and that has wind and solar aspects to it. It originally started as wind, and they've since expanded to be more solar and other renewables as well. And then the National Energy Education Development, again, US specific, that has great resources in all types of energy use. So really briefly, the AK Energy Smart, I want to make sure I highlight this because we have these lessons that are available for anybody to be able to use on our website, akenergysmart.org, and they're broken down into these K through 2, 3 through 5, 6 through 8, 9 through 12, and incorporate those things, those methods, which I mentioned earlier, to really make this impactful, important energy education as we think about our resources and how to use them. Wind for Schools, like I said, is a national program. There's 12 states that participate in it. There's a national nonprofit, which is taken over. It used to be through Department of Energy, and now a national nonprofit is running that. And there's actually 7 turbines installed at or near schools in Alaska, when Department of Energy had a bunch of money back in like 2011, 2012, we're able to put those up, but not doing that anymore, but still keeping track. Thanks, Joanna, for putting that link in there. And as kind of part of the Wind for Schools program, there's this thing called the KidWin Challenge, which I want to make sure I had some time to talk about this because this is one of those things that is really project-based. It can be really local. This is something students can build a model wind turbine and then they test it in a wind tunnel and see how much electricity it produces. This past year was all virtual. And we in Alaska, actually, we expanded that so that it wasn't just wind. We also had solar, hydro, and efficiency as part of that challenge. And then there's a national KidWin Challenge that was held in June. And we had 2 middle school teams that participated and they got 2nd and 5th out of like 35 teams. So I was really excited about that. And then just this is about need that they have free lessons that folks can download from their website. So if you're looking for more resources, this is a great option to find those. A few of the things that we've done during the pandemic, because that has definitely been interesting the last 18 months, we did all our teacher trainings and workshops were all virtual, and we were able to do 16 of them and reach 410 teachers. And the way that we were able to make this really effective is that we provided continuing education credit for the teachers, which they need to renew their teaching license. We shipped them kits of supplies so that they could practice hands-on lessons. It wasn't just us like talking at them on Zoom for 15 hours. We did an introduction, we gave them supplies, so they practiced the activities. And it was certainly not as good as in person where we can do tours and things, but we were able to have like guest speakers from around the state be able to participate. So definitely pros and cons there, and have teachers from rural communities who maybe wouldn't have necessarily participated before as well. And so with those teacher trainings and other teachers, we also sent out just a bunch of energy education kits. We used our funding instead of for traveling. We just sent it out to teachers so that they could utilize these supplies and have them in their classroom. And then we were able to do some virtual activities with students. It was definitely far less interaction with students since we're not part of a school district, and teachers were just so slammed and just had no time for anything other than just trying to keep their own heads afloat. But we were able to do some things, which was fantastic. We did a 6-week solar engineering class with homeschool students, work with the Alaska Native Science and Engineering program with some STEM challenges. We even did a 5-day virtual clean energy camp with them this summer, and then the Clean Energy Olympics, which I mentioned. And so just really some takeaways that I think we've all figured out of the pandemic, but things that we have done that's really been helping with us is this collaboration with ANSEP, with Alaska Center for Energy and Power, Arctic and Earth Science, part of the International Arctic Research Commission, Bristol Bay, career and technical education. I mean, just all these sorts of partnerships and working with folks so that we're not alone in this, of course. And that I mentioned this virtual educator trainings are a big success, and still having that emphasis and focus on place-based activities and resources. Been impressed too with this. I was able to join for a couple hours this morning on the live stream, and it's just been awesome, the flexibility and grace that everybody has as things are having difficulties and things change. So that's just want to wrap that up, that here's a lot of the different things that we do. Here's my contact information, which I can throw in the chat as well. And we do have Facebook and Instagram. We have a newsletter if you want to check out on our website. We send out once a month. So Koyana, Mashito, Nishtish, thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Colleen. That was impressive. I'm not pulling it all the things you do into such a short blip. So well done. So Kenny, go ahead and let's hear from you, and then we'll have a couple questions for the panel.
All right. Thanks. First off, I just want to say thanks to Joanna for inviting me, and then thanks to Dr. Jeffries and Colleen for your presentation. That's really good. I come from Georgia, USA. So I think what I want to do first is tell you a bit about my background, because it is important and how I ended up doing this for outdoor education, experiential education. And I'm coming to you from Bali, Indonesia. It's 7:30 in the morning. You probably saw I was having my morning coffee. I'm wearing our traditional batik shirt because every Thursday is traditional clothing day. So we wear our batik shirts and our sarongs, which is essentially a kilt or a skirt that men wear. So you won't see that, but that's what we'll be wearing today. Like I said, I'm originally from Georgia, USA, and I grew up playing outside until dark. And this is an important thing that I think is now missing from American childhood and from childhood in general, even now in Indonesia and the places that I work. And I'll connect back to that in a little while and explain why that's important. But I wanted to give a little bit about my background and how I ended up here. So I grew up in Georgia. I ended up teaching in California for a while at an outdoor science school. I taught in public schools. I taught in a nature center. And about 20 years ago, I jumped across the pond to Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. And I was teaching at an international school there, teaching classroom science. And I had a desire to learn a bit more. So I ended up going to Montana State, and Bozeman is where I met Joanna doing my master's degree. And along the way, I had some really interesting experiences working in field research, working in field biology. And I always found that for myself, that's where the knowledge really clicked in and where I really gained a lot of insight and passion into science, and especially learning ecology, natural history. And in Montana, we were really lucky for our master's degree that we could choose a lot of field courses. So all these things start adding up for me. I think that was maybe 8 or 10 years ago. And basically, I wanted to do hands-on in the field science. I didn't really want to do too much classroom theoretical learning. And so I've discovered that that is a big bonus for a lot of students that I currently teach. Is it really brings the curriculum alive. It really brings their learning to the forefront. And so as part of that journey, like I said, I grew up playing outdoors. I ended up doing a lot of field biology, a lot of field work. Then I did my master's degree. A lot of it was experiential. Whoa, 15 years. Okay, at least 15 years. Yes, my timelines are a bit skewed at times, I think. And how that plays out is that about 10 years ago, and I think that is true, I left classroom teaching and I started doing full-time experiential education. And all over Southeast Asia, from Chiang Mai, Thailand, down to Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, through South Singapore, throughout Indonesia, and even a little bit over to Vietnam, Cambodia, as well as the Philippines. So I've been taking kids on adventures for at least 10 years. And because I am a classroom science teacher, I always incorporate some kind of science. So if we are rafting, we'll do some water ecology. If we're hiking, especially in Bali, we'll do geology and volcanology. If we are in the field in Chiang Mai, we'll do farm to table rice ecology, rice field ecology. So I've always thought that was a good way for students to learn and to connect what they're learning in the classroom to the curriculum, is hands-on in the field. And so that brings us to the current day. You can see behind me, I'm in Green School in Bali, which is basically a school that's built entirely out of bamboo with the theme of sustainability and experiential education and environmental education built into the curriculum. So we're very lucky that every Wednesday we have a program called Jalan Jalan. And that means, in Indonesian, that means wander around or walk around. And what they do is every Wednesday they have an experiential education field trip. So we're very lucky. Some of the kids will go learn how to make chocolate. Some will go learn about social entrepreneurship. Some will go on a pure adventure and go rafting or biking, depending on what they choose. And then they'll rotate through those. So all that basically starts connecting for me on why I think this is really important. And so I want to share a couple of stories that I think sort of underscore why kids need to be outside learning. So you'll remember I said I grew up playing outside until dark. And I think if you were born in the 60s or 70s or even before the 1980s, that was probably your experience. But what I found is that is not happening anymore, especially in urban areas, especially in America. But I found it to be true in Kuala Lumpur. I found it to be true in Bangkok. I found it to be true in Jakarta and Singapore, basically all the urban areas. Kids don't go outside. And what that means for me is they're losing a connection with nature. They don't have a context for biology. They don't have a context for ecology. They don't have a context for botany or zoology or entomology. And my understanding is those departments are declining in universities for that reason. Students don't know about it. They just don't know that that is an option. And with a focus in the sciences more on genetics, biochemistry, high-tech biology, I think we're losing touch with our field sciences. And I personally think that this is a shame. So a couple of stories that I'd like to share that sort of underscore it is during the last 10 years, I have been leading trips for kids all over Southeast Asia. And in one particular, it was a family trip, and I had a family from Bangkok. And we were in Sulawesi. We were about to go rafting. And so the background is this student was now a university student. He had graduated from a very expensive private school in Bangkok. And he had gone back to America to study, bioengineering or something related to that, engineering in the sciences. I think ecosystem, I can't remember exactly, but it was something related to bioengineering. He had graduated from the International Baccalaureate program with honors. He was obviously very smart. He was going to a top university, and I think Washington, D.C., or in that region, in that area. And what happened next was really interesting. So we were standing in the watershed. We'd spent the morning, and keep in mind, this is Sulawesi. It's pretty wild. It's very tropical. We had driven up a mountain. We had gotten to the field site where we were going to go rafting, and we were putting on our life jackets and our helmets. And this highly educated international baccalaureate student looked at me and said, "So, how does the water get here?" And because I am a science teacher, and in my middle school science classes, I teach the water cycle. And throughout my career, I've taught the water cycle in primary school. And I know that he would have been exposed to it in the IB because it is part of the curriculum. I was astounded. As you can imagine, I was thinking, how did he miss this? I am almost certain he's been exposed to this several times, at least in theory. So I asked him, have you heard of evaporation and transpiration and precipitation? And he said, oh, yes, I remember those diagrams. But it dawned on me and it clicked. He had never experienced it. He had never actually seen the watershed, the water cycle in real life. Growing up in Bangkok and learning about it in the classroom is very different than standing in the middle of a watershed about to go rafting in Sulawesi. And so that was one of the moments where I thought, whoa, hands-on experiential education is pretty crucial. We can't assume that students are playing outside and learning these things intuitively anymore. As I mentioned, growing up in the 70s in Georgia, I was never allowed in the house. So basically, I would always spend my days cycling, fishing, digging up worms, playing in rivers, playing in creeks. I had a knowledge of the water cycle that was not academic. I think you need both. He was obviously smart. He was studying bioengineering or some related field at a very top university in the DC. He had graduated with honors, but he didn't have the knowledge of the water cycle that was intuitive to someone that grows up outdoors. So that's one story that I thought was really important. Like, why is it crucial for kids to get outside? And not just kids, all of us, by the way, adults too, you need to get yourself outside and play. Another story, we were hiking across Bali, and this was an adult trip. It was all adults, and every day we were hiking, and we came across this local lady, and she was walking through the rice fields. I do speak Indonesian, so we started a conversation with her, and basically we said, how are you? These are the niceties. Have you eaten already? These are the things people greet you with. Have you had a meal today? And so we had all of the local Indonesian superficial conversation. And then we started asking her questions. Where do you work? She worked at the nearby tourist attraction, which is a water palace. And we said, what time do you work? And she didn't really know how to answer that. She said, well, when the sun comes up, that's when I work. And when do you go to work? Well, of course, after I've fed the cows, watered the animals, fed the pigs, the chickens, that's when I go to work. Well, how long do you work? Well, I work until my work is finished, of course. She did not understand our context. She had no idea what we were asking. Where are you from? Well, I'm from this village. Okay. How long have you lived here? My whole life, but I'm an orphan. So we started having this interesting conversation. She had been raised by the village. And we said, well, how do you know when it's time to work? And she said, well, I know it's time to work when the sun comes up, and I know it's time to not work when the sun goes down. And so a really interesting conversation ensued until it clicked that she had no idea of mechanical time. we showed her a watch and she said, "What is that?" We said, "It's a watch. That's how you tell time." She had never seen one. She didn't know how to read a mechanical watch. So this was only a few years ago, and the lady was probably in her 40s or 50s, but she had grown up her whole life in a natural rhythm. And she really had no idea of our westernized mechanical Newtonian, time scale, time frame. And it really clicked for all of us because we were all adults that had grown up in the West. We were all hiking across Bali for recreation. She did not understand why we were walking for fun because, as the saying here is, only mad dogs and Englishmen go out in the midday sun. And so why were we doing that if there was no purpose? So the concept of hiking for recreation didn't exist for her. So it was a very interesting cultural exchange. And I think my takeaway message is there are, worldviews, there are people that don't have the same ideas as we do in terms of their global worldview. And I met one of them. And keep in mind, this is Bali, Indonesia, the most touristed island in Indonesia with about 4 million tourists a year. And this lady had grown up in this village completely in a time frame that was biological. She had no idea of the mechanical time. And so I thought that was really profound. And, it really impacted me in terms of how I want my daughter to grow up, in terms of how I educate our students and them having lost contact with the natural world. And here was a lady that was totally opposite. She only knew the natural rhythms in the natural world. And I think the last story I will share is a little bit of the opposite. Working with a lot of students from Singapore, every year they would come up to Chiang Mai and stay on the farm. My job was to teach them rice field ecology, and we worked with local Thai farmers. And it was a 3-day program that they would stay on the farm, and the other days they would be hiking, rafting, doing cultural events. And the takeaway message was these students from Singapore were so bubble wrapped and so safe that one of the students injured themselves digging. And then the teacher said, "Nope, we can't have that anymore. They might get injured." And so my response was, how can they connect with the earth if we're so protective and so worried that they're going to cut themselves with a shovel and that we don't allow them to dig in the dirt? And so that's what I'll leave you with. I think what I want to do is in the chat box, I'll put one of my favorite quotes from E.O. Wilson. And this is what I really believe. Hands-on experience at the critical time is not systematic knowledge. That's not what counts. It's better to be a savage and run around and play and explore and wonder for a while and just search and dream. So I think that's what I'll leave you with. And there's a lot to think about, but I'm really thankful to all of you guys for letting me share what I'm doing here in Bali. Thanks, Joanna.
Thank you, Kenny. And of course, you pick one of my favorite biologists. E.O. Wilson is marvelous. When I was in DC, I was lucky enough to hear him a couple times. But so in terms of our questions, I wanted to start off. I know I'd sent you guys some possible questions, but as you were talking, I had a couple other things sort of occur to me. So shockingly, I'm going off script. So I'm sure you guys will be just fine. The first question I'd love to hear your thoughts on is, what would you tell somebody who wanted to start an environmental education program in their community? What are the key things and maybe some of your favorites about that?
I'll give it a go. I would say, making sure that you're not working alone, that collaboration is so key. So finding those who are already passionate about the work, finding those who are already within the community who would be happy to help support you, and including as much as possible that Indigenous knowledge and working with the elders and those who are around you. And aside, other than the funding part, which is always the hard piece, it seems like, utilizing that, and don't reinvent the wheel, take advantage of those collaborations and the amazing resources and networks that are already out there to help support you.
Joanna, it's Martin. Sorry, I was trying to find the mute button. I would just add by repeating what I mentioned earlier, and that's the importance of you, the researcher, scientist, engineer, whatever, the technical expert, subject matter expert, being fully engaged with the community group or whatever the group is that you're going to be working with. That you earn such a lot by that full engagement and being just totally involved yourself in it. I think also, think about what it is you want to pursue. What is the activity? And is it feasible, practical? What kind of equipment is needed? And therefore, do you need a lot of money? Or how much might you need? And where will you get that from? And also think about, how relevant is that activity to your local community or the group you want to get involved? People are going to want to get involved if they can see the relevance to them individually or as a group, that it's going to have some value to them as well. Over.
Right. I think a couple of points. One is play outside. Basically, that is how connections are made. That's how deep connections are made. And that's throughout your whole life. That's not just for kids. That's for us too. And I always have to remind adults, you need it just as well as kids do. You need to get outside and play. I think the second one is a lot of schools that I've seen do it backwards. And here we do follow the UN SDGs. That's part of our curriculum. We teach Sustainable Development Goals. But I think if you teach the goals and the issues and all the problems before they've made a deep connection, they don't have a context, and it's quite depressing for kids. So you want them to have the wonder and awe. You want them to have the love and joy for nature first before they worry about the issues. And I think a lot of schools do it backwards because the issues are easy to teach. They're on a poster and we can talk about those in a classroom. What's very difficult is the part of getting them outdoors and making that connection. You don't see a food web or a diagram or a habitat or niche and say, wow, I want to go outside and learn about that. That's not how it works. What you do is you play outside and you flip over rocks and you flip over logs and you find things and you go, what is that? You want to learn more about that. Then you go look up in the books. So I think those are the most important and most crucial things for us to all make connections to nature.
I'm glad you brought that up, Kenny. Right now we've been working on mushrooms in the classroom. It's one of my favorite fall ways to sort of, as you say, drag the kids outside who've been staring at the screens for too long. And of course, it went a little bit later than usual. And so bringing into the classroom, everybody brought in their mushrooms and most of them are disastrously decomposing. And we had one very large one that out of it fell, I swear, 50 maggots. And wow. The maggots were way more interesting than anything we've done for an entire month. So now we're doing a sudden, now let's learn about why they have bristles. But yeah, I mean, the various pieces that you have all been touching on in terms of sort of taking the time to deeply engage with the outdoors is that key that then helps us, whether we're content experts, teachers, children, wherever that hook comes in, but that connection with the actual experiences is vitally important. So thank you guys for bringing that up. It's interesting sort of stitching the different ones together. And then Betty, would you like us to wrap up or do I have time to ask them one more question?
I think there's time for a couple more questions. I'm enjoying this. And Kenny, that's how I ran my classroom for 35 years with that same principle. And that's how I lead my life, being outdoors in nature every single day.
Yep. Absolutely. All right. Well, we'll give one more. And I would just say, what's an unexpected outcome? Some of you have kind of touched on that, but what unexpected outcomes have you had from teaching environmental education in whatever context you'd like to deal with?
Well, it's Martin, if I can kick off very quickly. I think in my case, at the University of Alaska, Fairbanks, where I became involved in environmental education through research experiences for teachers and their students. I was not a member of the teaching faculty. I was research faculty. I wasn't required to teach. It wasn't in my contract. And so becoming involved with teachers and their students, I learned a lot about teachers and the teaching profession and gained a new appreciation for what a challenge it is for teachers and how much we owe teachers. And I started to think back to when I was a child and the teachers in my life that made a big difference. That if I could, I'd go back and thank them for making my life hell as a time. I was a lazy child. I didn't like work at school and so on. But I was very fortunate to have some good teachers. But also through meeting and working with these teachers, I also learned a lot about the practice of teaching. And that has informed teaching that I have engaged in since then. And that made a big difference. Over.